All right, I'm back for Tuesday crits on Tuesday this time. Let me see. Just got back from work and I am looking at the models. This one, first of all, big improvement. Like I think in a lot of areas here. I like the way you've defined the arms. I think the sort of stylized shapes on the shoulders are very effective. Let me see. Um, Yeah, I think the shirt area and the arms are working really well for me now. I think the holster or whatever this is could use more detail probably, at least on here. Maybe get some reference, figure out what that is. Um, for the face, I like the changes you've made. I like the bigger beard. I like the new hair. I think the new hair fits with what you're sort of going for here really well. I don't know about the scratching in of the detail on the eyebrows. I would maybe try to make the eyebrows out of a bunch of separate pieces like you did with the hair, or just have them be like one piece each without the etched detail on there, personally. But it's already looking much improved. I think there's a lot here that's super working. One thing that's been bugging me, and you could change this or not, but on the reference, his belt or his tie goes down to here, but maybe that's because he's bent over. I'm not sure if you want to bring that down further or not. Maybe Tom has a better idea of whether that's necessary or not. But I think to me his tie is looking a little short. Um, but that's nitpicky. I think the main thing I would say for this guy today is just like I think you've done a good job with what you've done with the legs, but I think there's a little bit further you could go. For one thing, let me see. I think his legs, just the overall shape of each leg is a little more tapered. It gets a little more skinny from the top to the bottom. Like his calf is not as wide as his thigh, and I feel like these are a little bit like this shape. Sorry, I don't know if you can see, but the like the thigh from the hip to the knee is sort of the same size and volume as from the knee to the foot. Like they're the same shape. It looks a little repetitive, whereas on the drawing, it's like the thigh is much thicker and there's more volume to it, and then it all sort of tapers down to almost a point for the foot a little bit. So I think maybe you could bring that in a little bit, and then but I really like the way you've started to shape out like the hips and the leg muscles, and just the way it's getting very stylized in a way that I think is pretty effective. So nice work with that for sure. Aside from that, I do think the sort of the whole back of the legs looks not finished, and maybe you know that already, but I think that you could probably get some reference of like tight slacks from the back, and figure out like what do we do with this butt shape here? How do we get that as confident and defined as like what you have up here on the shirt? I don't know if slacks like this have a crease in the back or not. That's something you could look into, or a seam, or obviously like there's probably back pockets and seams and stuff back here. So there's definitely work to do on the back half, and even on the front half. I would say like if you look at the reference, it's very hard to discern, but there's some lines here that sort of suggest a little bit of wrinkles and creases to me, and folds of the cloth, even though it's pretty tight. So you could do just a little bit of that, and I think you've done a good job of subtly doing some folds on the shirt. So I would say maybe a little bit less than the shirt, since it's a thicker fabric, but you could bring a little bit of that into sort of the pelvis area, at least. Maybe the knees, maybe the bottom, the ankles. Up to you, but I think there's a little bit you could do with that probably. But aside from that, yeah, I would go back into the back and try to detail, before you do pockets and seams and stuff. I would see if you could get a little more definition in the shape of the butt, and maybe if there's a crease back there. But once that's done, I would say, yeah, add some wrinkles and some pockets, and whatever you need to. I think you can probably search up reference that'll give you the answers you need for that. But aside from that, oh yeah, and my one other thing was I think the shoes look okay. They don't look bad, but they look a little bit simple. Like I would think even a simple shoe, a dress shoe, would have something like some layer or seam or line or something on it that gives it a little bit of interest. Because I think right now they look like, clogs or something. But I think other than the shoes and the back of the pants, really, this is coming out really nice. Actually, yeah, maybe you could get a little more detail on like the belt buckle here, but aside from all that stuff, really, it's looking pretty clean at this point. I think, yeah, aside from the legs and the feet, I think it's coming together really nicely, and you should be in good shape to start retopologizing very soon. So nice work. I really appreciate your taking the time to like work towards the suggestions and whatnot. So nice work. This one I'm gonna skip for now because it doesn't have reference included, like I talked about last week. But I see you uploaded your workflow videos, and I took a look at those, and I will make a separate video going over some of the stuff from that because I think there's useful stuff to talk about in those. But yeah, moving on. Okay, this character is looking more resolved. But I would say overall, it feels like to me like not enough time was spent on it. Like by far, not enough time, because I think like one thing is the feet are sticking through the shoes, which seems like something you would notice if you spent more than like if you spent enough time down there working on the shoes and getting the shoes looking good, you would notice that like the feet are sticking through them, right? So like I feel like, and just the general level of sort of detail and finish on here, I feel like it's just not enough time spent. I think you should be spending much more time on this model. It's not like bad or anything. It's just, this looks like a first pass rather than a final model. Especially, down here, you're trying to do these clean shapes and it's kind of messy. Especially over here or whatever. Like, it looks like a pretty good idea, but it's just not done to me. I think like the bow too, you could just have that way cleaner. The hair I think looks good. It is bugging me. Let me see. Bugging me how you have sort of the eyebrow sticking through the hair in a way that doesn't really make sense. You could probably just delete the eyebrow or move the hair or something. I feel like that's something you should try to like, that type of thing you want to resolve. You want to figure out either, it's sort of a tangent, right? You either want to have the hair way off from the eyebrow, so that's not happening, or have it completely covering the eyebrow, but having it like just barely sticking out is kind of weird looking, because it doesn't immediately read as an eyebrow. Face is looking pretty good. I think you've done some good detailing work on here, but still like it just looks very undetailed. And I know you're probably not going for a ton of detail, but even then, like there's parts you can resolve and clean up a little bit more. But I think the face is looking all right. I think the stuff like this, like I'm not sure, this doesn't reflect like a real sleeve to me. It doesn't look very resolved. It looks like you had sort of a smoothing thing that Subdivide gave you, and then you sort of drew on top of it and maybe sharpened parts of it, but I don't know, that doesn't look fully controlled to me, at least. But yeah, I mean, like overall, it's relatively clean. I just feel like, hair could be a lot cleaner. The bow could be a lot cleaner, because you have a certain amount of detail and resolution and control you have with the face, and maybe even the shirt. But then when you go to the back, it's like much muddier. So that's one thing I would say. But like, also, yeah, actually you have some very sharp definition of this hair curl right here, which looks good. But then when you go to the side, you have like what looks like the start of some hair sort of clumps here, but then they're completely smoothed out and there's no definition there. And you want to have, a relatively good amount of consistency between like this. I think this is good, and I would want to see this level of definition on, here, on here, on the bow, and on the hair. So I'm repeating myself now, but you get the idea. So then as for the FBX, I'm not sure what this is, because it doesn't look like a retopo. It looks like sort of a Z-remeshed model. It looks like it was done with a Z-remesher to me. in particular like the hair where, because Z-remesher is good, but it's not that smart. And, what you would want is for the edge flow sort of like here to follow the curves of the hair, right? And it's doing that on this one. Actually, sorry if you can't see the cursor. It's doing that on this one pretty decently. It's not perfect, but it's good. But then on this one here, it just completely loses it, and it looks like a mess, right? So the thing is, if you were doing like personal work or just doing a retopo to give yourself better sculpting geometry, this is fine. But if you're putting this in a portfolio for animation or games or something, you want to be able to show that you have good control of your topology. And having like an auto retopologized thing that's super messy is not going to make you look good. And you could leave it out, you could not show the wireframe, but people will notice if you leave the wireframe out, and they'll think, why is she leaving out the wireframe? So when you go to do your retopo, I would say like try to do it correctly and get the topology looking really good, because that's what's going to be portfolio material. I think like this is not something I would want to see in a portfolio. The face I think looks pretty decent. The face topology looks pretty correct, but once you get outside of that, I guess the hands are fine. This is, there's nothing wrong with this. I think when you get down to the feet, this doesn't make a lot of sense. There's not really any reason for, if you're retopologizing a model and you're going to bake down, you don't really have any reason to keep all these separate meshes, because like they're not holding the shape super well. And they're not a particularly distinct shape from the feet. Like if you go out to the silhouette, like maybe you would want to have them attached to the legs so that you can get a little bit of that that silhouette break from the straps or whatever. But like, you don't need to have all these separate meshes, and it looks pretty messy. You're still getting the toe sticking through the shoe. So like I would definitely go back in and try to like really retopologize this. I guess it's like UV mapped already, but I would say, it's not a good retopo. And I'd rather see a good retopo than, a nice sculpt with like Z-remeshed low poly. And lastly, I would say, I was going to share so I think the reference you have is very sort of it's very basic. It's not giving you a ton of visual information to work from. So I get you're going for something kind of simple. I'm not sure, because there's not really a lot of color except for the bow. And I was wondering, I guess like there's sort of a colored ear, but I don't know. That's not really skin color. So I'm not sure what is trying to be communicated color-wise with these drawings. I would like try to maybe look for more from your artist. But even if you're going for a black and white look, I would say this is one thing I was going to mention too. Sorry to get distracted. Try to think about like what your render is for. Like, what's the purpose of a render? Because it looks sort of like, this, you did a clay render just to do a clay render and not for any particular reason, just to turn it in, but like the purpose of your render is to show off your model. And when I zoom in on this, I'm just seeing big sort of oceans of flat gray. I can't see any form in this type of render. So when you compare that to like the ZBrush thing, or if I'm in Maya, even the sort of default Maya camera is showing me more shading and more form than the render is. So you want to have your render, if you need a light, put in a light. Just try to get like try to get a render that just shows the form of your character, because that really helps. The renders like on the drive are not super helpful as far as like critiquing the model, just because they're so blown out and there's not a lot of form shown. But yeah, anyway, what I was gonna say was, if it is meant to be like a black and white model, I would look at like I grabbed these links from, what's her name, Beth Kavanagh. She does these sculpts and they're basically monochromatic. They're kind of not safe for work sometimes, but like she does a really good job of sort of gradating value, um, and sort of adding a ton of interest. The way there's sort of lights and darks sort of that follow the form. It really helps to sell these as interesting and like pleasant to look at even when they're screwed up. Um, so that's what I would look at. Or give me 1 second. I have some ArtStation links I was gonna grab too. Okay, yeah, this is a model it's technically color, but it's all basically brown, so it's almost monochromatic. Um, and just see how there's like really good control of gradations. You know, this is light and then it gradates to dark around these edges, and these gradations really help to sell the form of the shape and add structure to the model. So I would really try to, since your shapes are so simple and sort of there's not a ton of sharp detail on here. I think that you'll really want to bring in some gradations of value, even if you have no color. And if you do have color, I would still try to do this. Is just like try to really sell the shape and form with value and lighting and baked in gradations and stuff. But I think like you've sold me on the face. I think the face is looking really good now. Um, and like overall, the general design I think is good. It's just super simple, and that's why I'm sort of advocating more work on the textures, because I think when you don't have a ton of interesting geometry, then you want to like have the textures really sell it. But yeah, I think apart from like the way the retopo is, it's basically on the right track. I think if you clean up the shoes and the hair, and maybe some of this stuff, uh, that's even all right. I'd say mainly this part and like the feet are your worst offenders right now. And also just like this doesn't look. This okay. This is one final thing I'd talk about is like the way the collar is. It looks very round. Doesn't look like the termination of a cloth collar, right? It just looks like one round shape intersecting another round shape, and you want to be able to control that. Even just adding some edge loops or something. But ideally you want to have better geometry here that is actually supporting the shape so that it doesn't look like this. But yeah, otherwise I think you're doing pretty good here. Yeah, that would be my advice, is work on the retopo, and if you can, like, more time on the sculpt to sort of bring up the level of detail to match the face, because I think the face is in good shape. It's just the rest of it looks like not enough time on it. But yeah, nice work. This one I'd love to talk about, but it is late, so I'm skipping this one. This one. Okay, so this one. The note I have open already, but whatever. This week I'm making the sculpt better and starting to quad draw and re-UV the subtools in Maya. I will need to add teeth and tongue in the rest of the clothing. Thanks for quits in advance. No problem. All right, so I'm zeroing in on this part right here. Excuse me. I think based on what I've seen in some of the other models, and this one, I guess, and this sentence here, I think maybe you guys have a misunderstanding of what retopology is supposed to be and what it's supposed to be for. You're not supposed to individually retopologize each subtool. There's no, you don't need to preserve all the separate subtools as separate meshes in your retopology. So as an example, I'm bringing up my dude from BFA. This is my alien. He's exploded for baking, so that's why that's like that. But so if I hide, that's the high poly, and then this is the low poly, right? So if we look at the low poly, this is my retopo. This is one mesh, which has one texture map, and then the body is another texture map. So that's why those are separate meshes, and separate colors. But like, okay, so the head is, I think, not useful here. But let's look at the body. So actually, going back to here, if you notice, like, the shirt is a mesh, which would have been a subtool in ZBrush. The suspenders are subtools. This back part is a subtool. This is a subtool. The arms and head are a subtool. The belt is a subtool. The buckle, all this stuff. All these pieces are separate, right? I don't need to retopologize each of these separate pieces as its own mesh. That's not necessary. In fact, going back to the low poly, like this is all one mesh. This entire body, forgetting these the holster and the ammo things or whatever. But like this is a little bit too low. Looking back on it, I wish I'd gone higher and added more detail and resolution here. But I'm old school, I guess. But anyway, like all this stuff is one piece. The belt is completely. If I turn the high poly back on, you can see it's following. It's all fitting onto the high poly more or less, but it's all one piece, even though the high poly is many separate pieces. That's because when you bake something, when you bake a normal map or whatever else, you know, it's just becoming a texture. So it doesn't really matter how many meshes this is. It just matters what it looks like. So I know you guys are taking the low back into ZBrush and like projecting it to get a new shape or whatever, a new version of the mesh, but you don't like, that's not a critical part of the process. That can be useful in certain circumstances, but like in a normal game pipeline, you don't do that. You have your sculpt done in ZBrush, then you retopo, you make your low poly, right? And then you bake. You don't take your low poly back into ZBrush and like project it. That's not like, it's not something I've ever done at work. And you know, again, like as Fook showed, it's something you can do and it can be useful, but it's not like a normal part of the pipeline. So that's something to keep in mind, I would say. Like, don't do that unless it is required to do something specific. And like most of the time, it probably isn't. Anyway, so that's basically what I wanted to say is like, don't try to, you know, if I had tried to make this one mesh and this one mesh and all that stuff, like it would have made baking like insane and really hard to do because there's too many meshes, you know. Going back to the ballerina, like the shoes and straps were separate meshes and they don't have to be. Like I would just make that just one big piece, like going back, you know, this is all one big piece. The foot, the shoe, the pant leg, the cuff is all one piece. Because, you know, once you bake it down, it looks fine. Because you have all that detail in the normal map from your high poly. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say about retopology. Okay, I'm back. In between pausing the video and starting it again, I remembered I'm an idiot and you're doing an animation pipeline. So for animation, you probably wouldn't want to bake everything down onto one mesh with a normal map, obviously. So yeah, you're actually probably fine doing it as some separate pieces and bringing it back into ZBrush. I think that does make more sense as for a super high res like animation asset than it does for a game one. So don't forget what I said, because it still applies to I think most of the rest of everybody. And you know, if you make a game asset, it'll matter. But anyway, I think you're good. Looking at what's here, I'd say I'm not an expert in face topology, but this looks good. Eyebrows separate, I think, is good for animation. Make sure if you do rig it, like that's pretty consistent with the head under it. You don't want like the eyebrow sliding on the face. That, you know, I don't know about that. But I talked about that last time. Let me see. I don't love the topology here. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me that you would have like all these stars when really, like, one sec, you know, really for a body, all you need for topology is like it's just a cylinder. I would expect to see something more like that, you know. And if it's flaring out at the bottom, then you know you have that. That's a mouse drawing, so don't judge it too harshly. But you know, like something more straightforward, I think. And having all these sort of weird stars and this curvature, like, I don't know if it's helping you very much, and it will be harder for that harder to weight that, harder for it to deform. You know, might not be the end of the day, but it's just not great practice, and for a portfolio, you want to have clean, like, traditional topology usually. Um, yeah, I mean, it looks like a lot of this is work in progress, so I don't want to go in on stuff that's not ready for prime time. But let me see. This stuff, mostly clean. I'd say, you let me see. If this is meant to be subdivided, then it's looking good. I think actually, I don't want to subdivide all this because some of it looks danger zone, but yeah, I mean, also, so going back to the animation versus games thing, like if you're doing an animation character for like a Disney movie or whatever, um, yeah, I would say you wouldn't necessarily want to have these all as one piece. You'd probably want to have each wrap like separate and disconnected, unless you already have that. I'm just missing it. No, it looks like these are connected, and so like, you know, you want to actually model that strip and wrap it around probably so that it's very consistent. Um, because with animation, with rendered out production renders, you don't you don't need to optimize nearly as much. You want to optimize for rigging and for animation, but like, um, you don't have to simplify your geometry in the same way, especially for clothing and stuff, because a lot of the time that gets sort of simulated on later. Um, I'm also making stuff up because I don't use Maya for production rendering, but I think that's true. Anyway, maybe don't get too caught up in that stuff because you do have, plenty to do aside from that. But sort of thinking out loud here, I think this looks a little pillowy. I'd want to see a little bit more like, hmm. I think it's just sort of, this happens on every subdivided model. You get sort of a, even if you have a sharp edge, it will often have sort of a round curve past it. And it takes some effort to clean that up and get that consistent. But I think it helps make it look not like a Maya model to have that looks bad. But to try to have control over when it's round and when it's flat, because I feel like everything's sort of round here, even though you do have some nice creases. Uh, but yeah, do what you have time for. Obviously, I think this is coming out pretty nice overall. So I wouldn't get too bogged down in my nitpicks, but I'm just offering things to work on if you have time, I guess. Yeah, this looks like it's not been gotten to yet, but yeah, I think the overall like proportions, the body shape, the face is improved. It still looks creepy, but I think once it's got textures on there and like teeth, it'll be fine. So yeah, I think you're headed in the right direction. Yeah, I would still, if you can, like try to make these hair pieces, um, more modular, like the front hair, because I think this is working the best. But other than that, yeah, nice work. This character is looking super dope. Now I'm super into this. I really love the attention to detail and getting all the bamboo and like all this stuff. This is super cool. So as a retopo, I think it's not bad. So I'm gonna pick on a few things, but first of all, I'm gonna swap it for a Lambert so it renders a little better in the viewport. I did notice the hand looks fucked up. I think you would want to just like what do we do? Unlock. It looks like it's just maybe you flipped it. Let me see. No, these are both backwards. So you, I guess, reverse normals and soften it back up again. So that makes it better. Um, I don't see any other problems like that on the model, but maybe double check and see if you have any other stuff like that going on. Something to watch out for. So this one seems like it's sort of doing the same thing as um, the other models where you're retopologizing every piece separately. And you don't have to do that. I think, like, especially down here, like, there's no reason to have this piece separate from this piece. In fact, you're getting some interpenetration here, and like, really, you want all this at least, and this, whoops, you want all that to be one mesh probably, and have it be watertight. And a lot of this is super layered and complicated, so there are going to be times when you do need things to be separate pieces. In fact, with this belt and whatnot, I think you could persuade me that this stuff needs to be separate just because it's so complex. But even then, you want to make sure that it's clean, and like the way these are interpenetrating isn't super clean. If I hide this, like you could probably make that in that one piece. This stuff is getting super nasty in here, right? And that's my main worry with this whole thing is like, you're going to have to bake this. You're going to have to bake texture maps from this. And if we go back to my guy, if we go back to my guy, you may remember from the other video, like, look how I exploded him out. Just these pieces, he's actually like a super simple character. There's very little complex geometry that's going to cause baking problems. But this stuff is still going to cause, the maps are going to bake through each other and create a ton of ugly artifacts here, right? So I'm exploding this stuff out so that it bakes cleanly without intersecting with the main mesh. And with a guy this simple, if I need to do that, like think of all the stuff you're going to have to separate out and explode, like even just this stuff, even these pieces from this drawer, you're probably going to want to explode out unless you're going to retopo this again and make it lower and just have this be a flat surface, right? There's so much stuff here that needs to be cleaned up and exploded out from itself. Like a lot of it just doesn't look like a retopo. Maybe I'm misunderstanding this as being a retopo when it's actually just like a really clean high poly before subdivision. I'm not really sure, but like try to understand what you're attempting to do here, because what you're trying to do is make a simplified watertight set of low poly meshes that will be easy for you to bake down onto and easy for somebody to rig. So like obviously there's a really complicated character here, and but like a lot of this stuff just isn't going to bake out good, especially all these interpenetrating pieces. Like there's no way that this is going to work. So despite like all the topology being pretty clean, the overall effect is going to be super messy. I'm not sure if you started UVing this yet. No, that's good. Cause yeah, like this is really good. It's just not good as a retopo. And if it's not a retopo, then forget everything I said. But like you're gonna have to figure out. This is a difficult part of this process. Is like, how am I gonna retopo this head? If it was me, I would probably do a lot of it as one mesh. I'd probably keep the mask and the hood together, and then this stuff and this stuff. Maybe even the lantern, depending on context and whether, I'd expect that to come off at some point for a game or for an animation. But yeah, part of the process here in deciding what's going to be one piece or not is figuring out like, how am I going to explode this out when I do bake it? Because that's something that you will need to do in order for this to work, because there's just so many things that are either interpenetrating or super close to each other, and that's going to cause issues. Apart from that, like I think your polygon distribution is relatively good. I would say for the mask, like if it is a mask and not a face, and it's not going to animate or deform or anything, you can probably lose a lot of these faces and spend them elsewhere, like getting some of this stuff a little bit cleaner and rounder. But overall, like I'd say the distribution of detail is good here, and I think your attention to getting all these parts is super cool. Unfortunately, that means it's going to be harder to retopo because there's so much stuff to do, but like this is actually looking super dope, and I think if you can get it retopoed effectively and bake that stuff down and get a good material, it'll be a great piece. The last thing I would say is just obviously this isn't like posed yet, but once you do, try to remember balance and make sure that this doesn't look like, you know, they're way off balance to the back, because I think that's sort of how it looks right now, which makes sense for like an A pose. But yeah, once you rig it, it'll probably have to be more tilted forward than the concept art was, because that looked a little sketchy to me. It's hard to tell from this angle, but I think if you took this character and rotated them, they might look a little bit unlikely to stay upright. So that's one thing I'd think about. But also, it gives you an opportunity to do a really like dramatic, you know, pose where they're like, oh my god, this thing's so heavy. Actually, yeah, one other thing. This looks really low on their back compared to the concept. Looks like it stops just below the belt, and then you have it way down here. But yeah, maybe that's intentional. I don't know how you're planning on rigging this if you are, but hopefully some of that's useful. I really appreciate all the attention to detail with this geometry here, and like getting all these ties and stuff. This is super nice. Yeah, yeah, you know, a lot of this doesn't look like a retopo. This looks like your high poly that's just not smooth. Not that. But yeah, yeah. I'm not sure what this is, because some of it looks like it's meant to be smooth and some of it looks like it's not. Obviously, like this looks like it's not, but it's also pretty low poly. So make sure that you have a consistent and complete high poly mesh, and also a consistent and complete retopo, you know, watertight. Retopos don't always have to be watertight, but a lot of that stuff should be. If you have a good reason for it not to be watertight, then go for it. But yeah, so there's, I think, a lot of work to do in retopologizing this, but you've got a really, really good block out here. So nice work. And lastly, this one is also coming out super nice. I am very impressed with how this low poly has turned out. Everything seems to be sort of working out, which is awesome to see. Even like this looks like a real retopo here, where you have some stuff that's being turned into like a watertight mesh with the belts and stuff. Once again, like I was talking before, you will at some point, if you have all these interpenetrating pieces, like, you know, either need to separate them out or do the thing in Substance Painter where you name the meshes all correctly and it perfectly bakes without you having to explode it, which is pretty hard to make work or set up. But if you can make that work, that also would do it. But in any case, you will need like some way to bake all this stuff without getting interpenetration with the cages and artifacts and stuff. So if you can do that, then great. I think you know, having a lot of this stuff separate makes sense, so that you don't have to have a ton of polygons and triangles like fitting this onto the skirt. And I think it's worth getting that slight silhouette bump on a lot of it. So yeah, I don't disagree with any choices you're making here. Really, the only thing I would say, aside from make sure you're prepared to bake all this stuff down, is like I would say like look for opportunities to like funk it up a little bit more. Like these, you know, stitches on the hat are symmetrical and they're all the same size, so maybe you could wonk them up a little bit. You know, the book is super square, super straight, and if you're going for like a slightly hand done look, you could maybe, you know, just slightly fuck it up, you know. Or maybe do that in the middle. But I would say, with regard to that type of thing, you could bake all this down, you know, keep it straight, undo all that stuff. You could keep all this stuff straight, right? And bake it all out. And then once you have it baked onto your final low poly, then you could start messing with this stuff. And that way you don't have to revise the ZBrush sculpt to match whatever, you know, wonkiness you want to do. You can just keep the ZBrush straight, keep the low poly straight, and then once it's baked, start you know, start skewing it and messing with it and trying to push those shapes, because, you know, the UVs are probably going to be good enough that it won't matter. You won't notice a big stretch or anything. Like I do that all the time at work. So I would say like that would probably be worth it, you know, just try to find ways to make some of this stuff not nearly perfectly symmetrical. I know the drawing's not like wildly asymmetrical, but just a little bit that'll humanize it, I think would be super cool. The lantern in particular looks very like perfectly straight, which doesn't really say, hand done to me. I would say, could go in there, and even if it's subtle, it can help to sort of add character and life to a model like this. Um, maybe I'm overdoing it. Who knows? Or have like a taper too. That can also be helpful. Whether it's in or out, whatever. Look for opportunities to do stuff like that. See if you can see any kind of inconsistency in the drawing that you can sort of exaggerate or copy. But yeah, this is all really small stuff, apart from the baking, which will be difficult, but I think it's definitely doable. So yeah, really nice work with this one. I'm excited to see where this goes. And I think that's it for today. So good job, everyone. Super cool to see all the progress. Can't wait to see what's up on Friday.